What is it that you think we need y'all for?
So I know a lot of women have probably stitched this, but I just wanted to add something to this conversation that I bring up all the time. Is even if you are the most successful woman in the freaking world and you sit here and you preach that you don't need a man, blah, blah, blah. Everybody at the end of the day wants companionship and wants relationships. I don't care how much you cry about it on the internet. But at the end of the day, if you need your trees cut, your yard work done, your trash taken out, your car fixed, your garbage disposal, the sink leaks, whatever the shit is around the house, you're going to call a man, a handyman, and you're going to indirectly still need a man. So make it make sense. Okay, bye.
There is a quiet shift happening that most people only notice once it has already passed them by. It is not loud, it does not march in the streets, and it does not ask for permission or validation. It simply unfolds as men choose silence over noise, peace over chaos, and solitude over constant negotiation. By the end of this video, you will understand why so many men have reached the same conclusion independently and why this shift is not temporary, not reversible, and not something that can be shamed out of existence. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content. And if you want to get every single video the moment we release it. These conversations matter, and the only way they continue is if you support the channel and help it grow. And I also want you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, and if you want to learn how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly and intelligently, go check out Angry's Crypto Academy right now. It is built specifically for people who want independence, self-reliance, and long-term thinking in a world that increasingly punishes those qualities. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to show some direct support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on, keeps the content coming, and it is genuinely appreciated. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening. Across the world, an enormous number of men are quietly stepping away from dating, relationships, and traditional expectations placed on them by society. This is not a trend driven by bitterness, and it is not the result of a single event or a single generation. It is the outcome of decades of accumulated experience, pattern recognition, and observation. Men did not wake up one day and collectively decide to disengage. They were taught over and over again through consequences, incentives, and repeated negative reinforcement. What many people fail to understand is that men do not need to be convinced to walk away. They need to be given enough evidence that staying no longer makes sense. For decades, men were told that relationships were a duty, that sacrifice was noble, that responsibility was the mark of maturity. They were told that their value came from what they provided, how much they endured, and how much they could absorb without complaint. At the same time, they were increasingly told that their instincts were wrong, their nature was flawed, and their presence itself was suspect. Over time, men adjusted. They stopped arguing. They stopped trying to explain themselves. They stopped trying to win approval from systems that had already decided their guilt. Instead, they observed. They watched how effort was rewarded, how loyalty was treated, and how easily years of contribution could be erased with a single accusation or emotional shift. And slowly, quietly, they began to exit. This exit does not look dramatic. It looks like a man deciding not to download dating apps again after deleting them one too many times. It looks like a man choosing to build a home gym instead of dealing with public spaces filled with tension and accusation. It looks like a man cooking his own meals, managing his own finances, and structuring his life around predictability rather than volatility. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like relief. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the idea that being alone is the same as being lonely. Those are not the same thing. Loneliness comes from the absence of peace, not the absence of people. Many men discovered that they felt more isolated in relationships filled with constant demands than they ever did in solitude. They realized that silence can be restorative, that routine can be grounding, and that independence can be deeply fulfilling. This realization did not come from ideology, it came from lived experience. Men were told repeatedly that they were replaceable, unnecessary, or inherently problematic. They were told to step aside, to defer, to apologize for existing. Eventually, some of them listened, not in the way that was expected, but in the only way that made sense. They stepped aside entirely. For decades, public messaging emphasized that men needed to change, improve, shrink, or soften in order to be acceptable. At the same time, there was no corresponding expectation placed on society to offer stability, respect, or reciprocity in return. Relationships became less about partnership and more about compliance. Effort was expected, but appreciation was optional. Responsibility was mandatory, but authority was treated as suspicious. When men noticed this imbalance, they did not stage protests, they did not demand apologies, they simply opted out. This is why so many men today are choosing simplicity over status. They are minimizing expenses, reducing obligations, and removing unnecessary stressors from their lives. They are keeping their money, managing their time, and prioritizing peace. This is not a rejection of society as a whole. It is a recalibration of priorities. Men have always been builders. When the external world becomes hostile or unpredictable, they build inward. They create structure, routine, and personal order. For some, that looks like focusing on career without social entanglements. For others, it looks like early mornings, quiet evenings, and a life that answers only to their own standards. The common thread is control. Control over time, energy, and attention. Many women are now expressing confusion and frustration over this shift. They describe it as sudden, inexplicable, or unfair. But from the perspective of men, it feels inevitable. Men were told for years to leave women alone, not approach, not engage, not assume interest. They were warned that misinterpretation could carry severe consequences. So they adapted. They stopped approaching. They stopped initiating. They stopped trying. What is often overlooked is that men took these messages seriously. They did not argue semantics. They did not try to negotiate exceptions. They simply complied fully. And now, many of them see no reason to reverse course. This has created a reality where men are no longer competing for attention in the way they once did. They are no longer subsidizing lifestyles that do not offer stability or reciprocity. They are no longer financing experiences that provide no long term value. Instead, they are investing in themselves, their comfort, and their future security. There is also a broader economic and social context to the shift. As life becomes more expensive and systems become more fragile, risk tolerance drops. Men assess outcomes pragmatically. They ask whether the potential reward justifies the potential cost. Increasingly, the answer is no. The margin for error has shrunk, and the consequences of mistakes have grown more severe. This does not mean men are incapable of connection. It means they are more selective about where they place trust. Trust is no longer given based on words or labels. It is earned through consistency, behavior, and observable reality. Men are relying less on promises and more on patterns. What emerges from this is not despair, but clarity. Men who walk away often report feeling calmer, more focused, and more grounded than they ever did before. They rediscover hobbies, health, and self respect. They find satisfaction in competence and autonomy. They stop measuring their worth through external validation and start measuring it through internal stability. This is deeply unsettling to a society that depends on male labor, attention, and resources while offering diminishing returns in exchange. When men stop participating in systems that drain them, those systems feel the absence immediately. But instead of introspection, the response is often panic or blame. Men are not leaving because they hate women. They are leaving because the cost of participation no longer makes sense. They are leaving because peace has become more valuable than approval. They are leaving because they finally realized that constant compromise without respect is not virtue, it is erosion. As more men make this choice, the social landscape continues to shift. Public spaces change, economic patterns change, relationship expectations change. And through it all, men remain largely silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have already said it through their actions. This is the beginning of a new phase, not a temporary pause. Men who have built lives around solitude, order, and self sufficiency are unlikely to abandon those foundations. Once peace is established, chaos loses its appeal. Once clarity is achieved, confusion no longer persuades. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. We are witnessing a large scale reorientation of male priorities. It is not driven by anger, but by acceptance. Acceptance of reality as it is, rather than as it was promised to be. Acceptance that some systems are not designed for fairness, but for extraction. Acceptance that walking away can sometimes be the most rational response. This is not a collapse of men. It is a consolidation, a tightening of focus, a return to fundamentals. Men are choosing lives that they can manage, predict, and sustain. They are choosing themselves. And this is only the beginning. What many people underestimate is how deeply this shift reshapes a man's internal framework. When men step away from relationships and the expectations attached to them, they do not simply remove one part of life, they reorganize the entire structure. Time that was once fragmented by emotional negotiation becomes consolidated. Money that was once allocated toward impressing, maintaining, or compensating becomes retained. Energy that was once drained through constant vigilance becomes redirected inward. This is not stagnation, it is reallocation. Men begin to notice something subtle but powerful once they remove themselves from constant relational pressure. Their nervous system calms, decisions become clearer, goals feel attainable again. Without the background noise of uncertainty, conflict, or performative expectation, men rediscover what it feels like to move through the world without bracing for impact. That sense of internal steadiness becomes addictive, and once it is established, it is rarely surrendered willingly. This is why appeals to guilt or shame no longer work. You cannot shame a man out of peace once he has tasted it. You cannot threaten him with loneliness when he no longer feels lonely. You cannot frighten him with labels when he has already been labeled for decades and learned that compliance never bought protection. Men have crossed a psychological threshold, and once crossed, there is no easy return. For years, men were told that their role was to absorb discomfort quietly. That sacrifice was proof of character. That endurance was love. Over time, they noticed that this expectation was not mutual. Their sacrifices were assumed, not celebrated. Their presence was treated as conditional. Their boundaries were framed as selfishness. Eventually, the lesson became impossible to ignore. A system that punishes contribution while rewarding entitlement cannot sustain loyalty. Men learned to stop explaining themselves. Explanation implies negotiation. And negotiation implies that the other party is operating in good faith. When that assumption breaks down, silence becomes the most efficient response. Walking away is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of clarity. What we are seeing now is the long delayed consequence of years of messaging that told men they were unnecessary. Men listened, They adjusted. They removed themselves from spaces where they were unwanted or unwelcome. They stopped offering what was no longer valued. This is not abandonment, it is compliance taken to its logical conclusion. There is a tendency to frame this shift as men being afraid of responsibility. The reality is the opposite. Men are more aware than ever of responsibility, which is precisely why they are cautious about taking on obligations that carry disproportionate risk. Responsibility without authority is liability. Commitment without respect is exposure. Men understand this intuitively, even if they never articulate it explicitly. As legal, social, and economic consequences attached to relationships have intensified, men have recalculated the equation. They have noticed how easily stability can be disrupted and how little recourse they have, or once it is. They have seen peers lose years of progress overnight. They have observed how quickly narratives can flip and how little evidence is required to trigger severe outcomes. This is not paranoia, it is observation. Men trust patterns more than promises. Patterns reveal truth over time. And the pattern they have observed is one of escalating risk with diminishing reward. Walking away becomes not only understandable, but rational. In solitude, men regain authorship of their lives. They decide their routines, their standards, their pace. They eat when they want, sleep when they need to, work when it makes sense, and rest without justification. This level of autonomy was once rare. Now, it is increasingly common among men who choose to disengage from traditional pathways. The irony is that many men become healthier, more stable, and more content after stepping away. They exercise consistently because it serves them, not because they are trying to impress. They manage finances carefully because they see a future worth protecting. They cultivate skills because competence brings satisfaction. This self directed improvement is quieter and more durable than performative self optimization. Meanwhile, society struggles to interpret the silence. There is confusion about why men are no longer chasing approval, attention, or validation. There is frustration that incentives no longer work. But incentives only function when the reward aligns with the cost. When that alignment disappears, so does participation. Men are not immune to connection, but they are no longer willing to accept connection that feels adversarial. They are no longer willing to enter environments where they are presumed guilty, expendable, or interchangeable. Respect is not optional. Safety is not a one-way expectation. Peace is not negotiable. This has ripple effects far beyond dating. Men withdraw from social scenes that feel performative or hostile. They opt out of workplaces that demand constant self negation. They avoid institutions that treat them as resources rather than people. Instead, they build parallel lives, smaller, quieter, more controlled. These parallel lives are not empty. They are structured around purpose rather than approval. Men fill them with projects, routines, and personal goals. They invest in tools, spaces, and systems that serve them directly. So home becomes a sanctuary rather than a pit stop between obligations. There's also a generational aspect to this shift. Younger men are observing the outcomes of older men and adjusting preemptively. They are not waiting to be burned to learn the lesson. They see what happened and decide early. This accelerates the trend and makes reversal even less likely. When critics accuse men of giving up, they misunderstand the nature of what is happening. Giving up implies defeat. This is not defeat, this is exit. Men are not trying to win a game they no longer believe is fair. They are choosing a different game entirely. The language used to describe men who walk away often reveals more about the speaker than the subject. Words like afraid, bitter, or weak are deployed reflexively. But these words lose power when they fail to match observable reality. Men who have structured stable, peaceful lives do not feel weak. Men who sleep well, save money, and wake up without dread do not feel defeated. Peace is persuasive. Once achieved, it becomes the benchmark against which all future choices are measured. Anything that threatens it must justify itself clearly. Most things cannot. This is why attempts to lure men back with nostalgia or moral obligation fall flat. Nostalgia reminds men of promises that were not kept. Moral obligation without reciprocity feels like manipulation. Men have learned to recognize both. There is also a deeper psychological shift taking place. Men who walk away begin to detach their identity from external roles. They stop defining themselves solely as providers, protectors, or problem solvers for others. They redefine masculinity internally based on self mastery rather than sacrifice. This internal orientation is harder to destabilize. For a long time, masculinity was framed as something that had to be earned through service to others. Now, more men are viewing it as something that begins with self respect. This is not hostility, it is recalibration. Men are not rejecting relationships because they fear intimacy. They are rejecting systems that demand vulnerability without protection. They are rejecting frameworks that punish honesty and reward instability. They are rejecting chaos masquerading as progress. As more men exit, the social narrative struggles to keep up. There is disbelief that so many men could independently arrive at the same conclusion. But this convergence is precisely what makes it credible. When individuals across cultures, backgrounds, and income levels observe similar patterns and respond similarly, it signals a systemic issue. Men did not organize, they did not coordinate, they did not need to. Reality provided the instruction manual. What comes next is not a dramatic confrontation. It is a slow, steady adjustment to a world where male attention, labor, and commitment are no longer guaranteed. This adjustment will be uncomfortable for institutions that relied on those things being automatic. It will be confusing for people who assumed men would always show up regardless of cost. Men are no longer default participants. Participation must now be earned. This does not mean men are unreachable. It means standards have changed. Trust must be built, not assumed. Respect must be demonstrated, not demanded. Stability must be mutual. Those who understand this will adapt. Those who do not will continue to express outrage and confusion. Men will continue living their lives quietly, without explanation. And as this shift continues, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Men did not walk away from society out of spite. They walked toward something better for themselves. Once that direction is chosen, it rarely reverses. This is not a phase, it is a correction. And we are still only seeing the early stages. As this correction unfolds, one of the most revealing dynamics is how little persuasion on it takes for men to remain disengaged once they have stepped back. There is no need for reinforcement campaigns or ideological reinforcement. The lived experience itself is enough. Men notice improvements in their mental clarity, physical health, and overall sense of control almost immediately. The absence of constant emotional turbulence creates space for reflection, and reflection strengthens resolve. Men begin to understand something fundamental about themselves that was often drowned out by expectation. They realize they function best in environments with clear rules, consistent feedback, and predictable outcomes. Chaos does not inspire them. Ambiguity does not motivate them. When relationships and social structures increasingly offer uncertainty while demanding total investment, men naturally withdraw. This withdrawal is often framed as men avoiding accountability, but accountability has never been the issue. Men are familiar with accountability. They have lived under it their entire lives. What they are avoiding now is asymmetrical accountability, where they are held responsible for outcomes they do not control, emotions they did not create, and decisions they did not make. No rational person willingly enters a contract where responsibility is mandatory but authority is forbidden. Men are also acutely aware of how narratives shift after the fact. They have seen how intentions are retroactively reinterpreted and how past goodwill can be reframed as obligation. They understand that memory is not always treated as a record, but as a tool. In such an environment, caution becomes wisdom. As men build lives centered on autonomy, they begin to place greater value on internal metrics rather than external approval. Progress becomes measured by stability rather than status. Success becomes defined by freedom rather than applause. Happiness becomes quieter, less performative, and more durable. This internal recalibration is difficult to reverse because it does not depend on others cooperating. Men who have walked away often report something that surprises people. They do not feel angry, they feel resolved. Anger requires engagement, resolution does not. Once a decision is made and reinforced by positive outcomes, emotional charge fades. What remains is preference. This preference for solitude does not mean men reject all connection. It means they approach connection differently. They are slower to trust. They observe longer. They test constancy rather than responding to charm. They are no longer impressed by declarations. They look for alignment between words and actions over time. This shift has also influenced how men relate to work. Many men are reassessing whether traditional career paths are worth the trade offs. They are exploring remote work, self employment, and alternative income streams that offer flexibility and control. The same logic applies. If effort does not reliably translate into security or respect, men seek different arrangements. There is a growing emphasis on resilience rather than ambition. Men want systems that can withstand shocks. They want lives that do not collapse when one variable changes. This leads to conservative decision making in the best sense of the word. Less leverage, less exposure, fewer dependencies. Men are simplifying not because they cannot handle complexity, but because complexity has been weaponized against them. Simplicity is protection. Another underdiscussed aspect of the shift is how it affects male friendships. As men disengage from romantic pursuit, they often reinvest in platonic bonds. These friendships are typically low drama, high trust, and mutually supportive. They revolve around shared activities rather than emotional negotiation. This reinforces the idea that connection does not have to be volatile to be meaningful. Men also spend more time alone with their thoughts, which leads to greater self awareness. Without constant distraction, patterns become clearer. Men recognize how often they compromised themselves in the past to maintain harmony. They see how rarely that harmony was reciprocated. This awareness is not painful so much as clarifying. Once clarity is achieved, it becomes the new baseline. This is why messaging that attempts to portray men as missing out rings hollow. Men who have found peace do not feel deprived, they feel relieved. The idea that they should mourn the absence of stress, obligation, and uncertainty does not land. It sounds like an attempt to sell chaos as fulfillment. There is also a cultural lag occurring. Society is still operating on assumptions that no longer hold. It assumes men will pursue regardless of risk. It assumes men will provide regardless of outcome. It assumes men will absorb regardless of cost. These assumptions are now outdated, but systems built on them take time to adjust. In the meantime, friction increases. Expectations clash with reality. Demands go unanswered. Confusion turns into frustration. But frustration does not bring men back. Only structural change would, and even then, trust would need to be rebuilt slowly. Men understand that once trust is broken at scale, it cannot be restored through messaging alone. It requires sustained behavioral change. And even then, many men will choose not to re engage simply because they no longer need to. Independence changes incentives permanently. Another reason this movement persists is that men are sharing information informally. They compare notes, they observe outcomes, they learn from each other's experiences. This distributed learning accelerates adaptation. Men do not need centralized leadership to recognize patterns. They rely on observation and peer experience. As more men opt out, the social feedback loop intensifies. Fewer men participate, which increases competition among those who remain, which raises expectations further, which drives more men away. This cycle is self reinforcing. Critics often argue that this cannot last, that men will eventually return out of biological or social necessity. But necessity is contextual. Men have always adapted to their environment. When the environment changes, so do strategies. Modern life allows for unprecedented levels of self sufficiency. Technology reduces dependency. Automation simplifies logistics. Entertainment, education, and social interaction are all accessible without physical proximity. The practical need to engage has diminished, making the emotional cost harder to justify. Men are not isolated in caves, they are connected on their own terms. This autonomy reshapes identity. Men stop seeking validation from institutions that no longer align with their interests. They become less reactive to criticism. They stop internalizing narratives that frame them as problems to be managed. They define themselves through action rather than labels. There is also a long term demographic implication to this shift. As men delay or avoid traditional family formation, timelines change. Expectations built around previous patterns no longer apply. This creates anxiety for systems that depend on predictability. But predictability was never guaranteed, it was assumed. Men have simply withdrawn their consent. It is important to emphasize that this is not a coordinated rejection of women as individuals. It is a response to systems, incentives, and repeated experiences. Men are not obligated to participate in arrangements that consistently disadvantage them. Opting out is not hostility, it is self preservation. Men who walk away often describe a sense of alignment they had not felt before. Their actions match their values, their time matches their priorities, their lives feel coherent. This coherence is powerful. Once achieved, it is difficult to abandon. Attempts to shame men back into participation misunderstand the nature of the change. Shame only works when people value the approval of those doing the shaming. Men who have detached from those approval structures are immune. This is why the discourse increasingly feels one sided. One side is demanding engagement, the other side has moved on. Men are not asking to be understood, they are demonstrating their decision through behavior. Behavior is the most honest form of communication. As this continues, society will face a choice: adapt to the new reality or continue clinging to assumptions that no longer reflect how men are choosing to live. Men have already made their choice. They chose peace, they chose clarity, they chose autonomy. And once chosen, those things are not easily surrendered. As autonomy becomes the, the defining feature of male life, for those who have stepped away, a deeper transformation takes place beneath the surface. Men begin to see themselves not as reactive participants in someone else's expectations, but as deliberate architects of their own existence. This shift changes how they evaluate every decision. Instead of asking what they are supposed to do, they ask what actually serves them. That question alone rewires an entire life. For many men, this is the first time they have allowed themselves to prioritize internal stability over external validation. From a young age, they were conditioned to equate worth with usefulness. To be valued meant to be needed. To be respected meant to provide. When those equations stop producing reliable results, men do not protest. They revise the equation. This revision leads to a fundamental reassessment of risk. Men are no longer willing to stake years of effort on outcomes they cannot influence. They are no longer willing to invest emotionally where accountability is vague and consequences are asymmetrical. They have learned that good intentions do not mitigate bad incentives. Systems reward behavior, not ideals. As men internalize this, they become more analytical and less sentimental about decisions that once carried emotional weight. Romance, cohabitation, long term commitment, and financial entanglement are no longer framed as milestones that must be reached to prove maturity. They are treated as optional arrangements that must justify themselves. This recalibration does not require bitterness, it requires honesty. Men acknowledge what they have observed and adjust accordingly. The adjustment is quiet because it does not need applause, it only needs to work. Another aspect of the shift that often goes unspoken is how it restores dignity. Men who walk away reclaim something that had been steadily eroded. They reclaim the right to say no without justification. They reclaim the right to exist without being framed as a problem. They reclaim the right to disengage from environments that drain them without being accused of failure. Dignity is not loud. It does not announce itself. It manifests as calm decision making and consistent boundaries. Men who have regained dignity do not seek confrontation. They seek distance. This distance creates clarity not only about others, but about themselves. Men notice how much of their previous stress came from attempting to meet expectations that were constantly shifting. They recognize how often they were placed in no-win scenarios. Once those scenarios are removed, mental bandwidth returns. With that bandwidth, men think long-term again. They plan, they save, they optimize for resilience. They invest in health because it pays dividends over time. They invest in skills because competence compounds. They invest in assets that cannot be taken through emotional leverage. This is why many men now prefer tangible progress over symbolic gestures. A well organized home, a stable routine, a growing savings account, and a strong body provide certainty that external approval never did. These things respond to effort predictably. Predictability is deeply undervalued until it is gone. Men who have lived in constant uncertainty recognize its absence immediately. There is also a noticeable change in how men communicate once they step away. They become more concise. They say less because they mean more. They stop over explaining because they no longer need permission. This is often misinterpreted as emotional withdrawal, but it is more accurately described as emotional efficiency. Men are still capable of depth. They are simply selective about where they deploy it. As this mindset spreads, it begins to influence cultural norms in subtle ways. Expectations around dating initiation change. Social scripts that relied on male pursuit weaken. The assumption that men will always fill the gaps begins to fail. Systems that relied on silent male compliance encounter resistance not through protest, but through absence. Absence is difficult to argue with. You cannot debate someone who is not present. You cannot negotiate with someone who has opted out. This is why absence provokes such anxiety. It removes leverage. Many narratives attempt to reframe male withdrawal as selfishness. But selfishness implies taking at the expense of others. What men are doing is declining participation. They are keeping what they earn, managing what they control, and refusing to subsidize instability. That is not exploitation. It is self management. Men are not obligated to sacrifice indefinitely. Obligation without consent becomes coercion. Once men recognize that, they act accordingly. This recognition is not sudden. It builds slowly over years of experience. A failed relationship here, a legal scare there, a public accusation, a workplace double standard, a moment of realization that effort is no longer rewarded. Each instance adds weight. Eventually, the scale tips. When it does, men do not rage, they disengage. There is also a philosophical element to this shift. Men begin to question narratives they once accepted without scrutiny. They ask whether promises align with outcomes. They examine whether ideals are supported by structures. They learn to separate intent from impact. This skepticism is not cynicism, it is discernment. Discernment leads men to favor environments where feedback is honest and consequences are proportional. This is why many gravitate towards solitary pursuits, technical fields, or systems with clear rules. Ambiguity is no longer appealing. Men who have walked away often express surprise at how little they miss what they left behind. This surprises them because they were told they would regret it. That regret never arrives. Instead, relief settles in. Relief comes from not having to perform, from not having to guess, from not having to apologize for boundaries. As time passes, men become more confident in their choice. Confidence does not come from validation, but from consistency. When day after day feels manageable and aligned, doubt fades. This creates a widening gap between those who have adapted and those who are still operating on outdated assumptions. Communication breaks down because the incentives are no longer shared. One side expects participation, the other side has moved on. Men are not trying to convince anyone, they are simply living differently, and the long term implications of this are profound. Institutions that depended on male participation must now compete for it. Relationships that once relied on default effort must now offer value. Social norms that assumed compliance must now justify themselves. This does not mean men are hostile to change. It means they require evidence. Words are no longer enough. Declarations do not override experience. Trust, once lost at scale, is not rebuilt through messaging. It is rebuilt through years of consistent behavior. Even then, many men will choose not to re engage because their lives are already full. This is another aspect often misunderstood. Men who walk away do not live empty lives, they fill them deliberately. They choose fewer commitments, but deeper focus. They choose stability over excitement. They choose ownership over approval. Ownership is empowering, it anchors identity internally. When identity is internal, external narratives lose their grip. This is why moral pressure campaigns fail. You cannot morally pressure someone who no longer seeks moral approval from you. Men have relocated their sense of right and wrong inward. They act according to personal principles rather than public consensus. As this continues, the cultural conversation becomes increasingly disconnected from reality. Debates rage about why men are leaving, while men themselves remain largely indifferent to the debate. They are not waiting for permission to live differently. Men are not obligated to fix systems that do not serve them. They are not required to sacrifice themselves to prove virtue. They are allowed to choose peace. And once peace becomes the standard, anything that threatens it must present overwhelming justification. Most things cannot. This is why the movement persists, not because men are angry, but because they are content. Contentment is quiet. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It simply exists. And that existence speaks louder than any slogan ever could. As contentment settles in, men begin to experience a form of stability that feels unfamiliar at first. It is not excitement driven, not dependent on novelty or validation, but grounded in predictability. This stability allows men to think in longer horizons. They stop living from reaction to reaction and start living from intention to intention. Days become structured, weeks feel purposeful. Life stops feeling like a constant defense against disruption. This shift has an interesting effect on how men perceive time. When they are no longer managing emotional volatility or navigating uncertain expectations, time feels slower and more usable. Hours are not lost to recovery from conflict. Energy is not drained by anticipation of the next demand. Men regain a sense of ownership over their schedule, and with it, their sense of self. That ownership reshapes priorities. Men start asking different questions. Instead of asking how to impress or how to accommodate, they ask how to sustain. They consider whether a choice adds resilience or introduces fragility. They look for decisions that reduce exposure rather than increase it. This mindset is not pessimistic, it is practical. One of the most noticeable outcomes of this practical mindset is how men approach responsibility. They do not avoid it, they redefine it. Responsibility becomes something they choose rather than something imposed. When responsibility is chosen, it feels meaningful. When it is imposed without agency, it feels burdensome. Men understand this distinction clearly once they step back. This is why many men become highly responsible in areas they fully control. They are disciplined with health, finances, and personal projects. They are reliable to themselves and to the commitments they voluntarily accept. What they reject are obligations that carry open ended liability without corresponding authority. There is also a subtle emotional maturity that emerges. Men who no longer feel pressured to perform or appease become less reactive. They respond rather than react. They listen without feeling compelled to fix. They disengage from drama without guilt. Emotional regulation improves when emotional leverage is removed. This often leads to misinterpretation. Calm is mistaken for coldness. Boundaries are mistaken for indifference, and silence is mistaken for weakness, but these interpretations do not change outcomes. Men who are at peace do not feel the need to correct misconceptions. They understand that clarity does not require consensus. As men continue to live this way, a gap opens between narrative and reality. Public discourse struggles to explain why men are not responding to incentives that once worked. Advice columns offer strategies that assume motivations men no longer have. Campaigns appeal to obligations men no longer recognize. The disconnect grows. What many observers fail to grasp is that men did not lose something when they walked away. They gained something. They gained consistency. They gained predictability. They gained the ability to plan without constantly recalculating around someone else's shifting expectations. This gain changes how men perceive compromise. Compromise is no longer something they fear, but something they evaluate carefully. They ask whether compromise is mutual or one sided. They assess whether it is temporary or permanent. They refuse compromises that require them to give up peace for promises. Promises are no longer currency. Outcomes are. Men have learned that words are cheap and structures matter. They look at incentives, they look at enforcement, they look at patterns. They do not argue about intentions, they observe results. This observational approach leads to a more detached form of wisdom. Men stop taking things personally that were never personal. They stop internalizing blame that was never fair. They recognize that many conflicts were not failures of character, but failures of alignment. Alignment becomes the new standard. If values align, engagement is possible. If they do not, disengagement is acceptable. This binary simplifies life dramatically. It also explains why attempts to rekindle old dynamics feel ineffective. Men are no longer interested in proving anything. They are not trying to demonstrate worth or masculinity. They are trying to maintain equilibrium. Equilibrium is fragile when too many variables are introduced. Men limit variables intentionally. Another important aspect of this evolution is how men redefine success. Success is no longer measured by milestones that require external approval. It is measured by how little stress a man carries into his evenings. It is measured by how well he sleeps. It is measured by how free he feels to say no. These metrics are invisible to others, which makes them easy to dismiss. But for the men living them, they are decisive. As men become more selective, they also become more patient. They do not rush decisions. They do not chase outcomes. They allow things to reveal themselves over time. This patience is not passive, it is strategic. Patience allows men to see consistency. It reveals whether behavior matches claims. It filters out volatility. Men understand that what lasts does not need to rush. This patience also applies to solitude itself. Men do not see solitude as a waiting room. They see it as a complete state. They are not waiting to be rescued from it. They are not counting days until it ends. This changes everything. When solitude is not a deficiency, it becomes a strength. It allows men to be selective rather than desperate. It allows them to evaluate opportunities without urgency. It removes fear from decision making. Fear was once a powerful motivator. Fear of being alone, fear of being judged, fear of missing out. As these fears fade, so does susceptibility to manipulation. This is another reason why messaging fails. Fear based appeals no longer land. Men are no longer afraid of outcomes they have already accepted and found manageable. What replaces fear is discernment. Discernment is quieter, slower, and more deliberate. It does not react to headlines or trends. It looks at trajectories. Men who have walked away often speak about how their sense of self has stabilized. They are less influenced by praise and less wounded by criticism. Their identity is not constantly negotiated. This stability makes them harder to control. Harder to control does not mean hostile, it means independent. Independence is uncomfortable for systems that relied on predictability. But independence is not rebellion, it is autonomy exercised peacefully. This peaceful autonomy is why there is no dramatic confrontation. Men are not marching, they are not issuing ultimatums, they are not demanding change, they are living differently. Living differently is the most powerful statement available. As time goes on, younger men see the outcomes and adapt earlier. They skip steps. They avoid mistakes they watched others make. This accelerates the shift and makes it generational rather than situational. Older frameworks struggle to explain this because they assume motivation that no longer exists. They assume men want what they wanted before, but desire changes with experience. Experience teaches men that peace is scarce and valuable. Once valued, it is protected. Protected peace reshapes relationships of all kinds. Men are more honest about what they will and will not accept. They do not negotiate boundaries they have already set. They do not apologize for standards. Standards are not demands, they are filters. This filtering process results in fewer engagements but higher quality ones. Men interact less but with more intention. They prefer depth over breadth. They prefer reliability over excitement. This preference also changes how men handle conflict. They avoid environments where conflict is constant. They address issues directly when necessary and disengage when resolution is unlikely. They do not linger in cycles that produce no improvement. This efficiency is often mistaken for emotional avoidance. In reality, it is emotional conservation. Men are allocating energy where it produces results. As this approach becomes normalized among men, it reshapes expectations across society. Assumptions about availability, compliance, and sacrifice no longer hold. Men are no longer default problem solvers for issues they did not create. This creates a vacuum. Vacuums force adaptation. Adaptation will happen eventually, but not on the timeline of those demanding it. Men are not in a hurry. They have removed urgency from their lives intentionally. Urgency benefits systems that need constant input. Calm benefits individuals who seek sustainability. This is the fundamental mismatch. Like men who walk away are optimizing for sustainability. They are building lives that can endure stress without collapse. They are minimizing dependencies that introduce instability. They are choosing paths that allow them to remain centered regardless of external shifts. This is not escapism, it is resilience. Resilience does not look dramatic. It looks boring. It looks repetitive. It looks unremarkable from the outside, but it works. And because it works, it spreads. Men do not need to be convinced. They only need to see. They have seen enough. As men continue optimizing for sustainability, another shift becomes visible in how they interpret responsibility towards society as a whole. For a long time, men were taught that their role was to stabilize systems regardless of how those systems treated them. They were expected to absorb inefficiencies, tolerate contradictions, and compensate for structural failures through personal sacrifice. Over time, many men realized that this expectation was not rooted in fairness, but in habit. Habits persist until they are questioned. Once questioned, habits lose their authority. Men began to ask whether their continued participation actually improved outcomes or simply delayed necessary corrections. They noticed that systems rarely reform when propped up indefinitely. Pressure creates change, but only when pressure is allowed to exist. Withdrawal of effort is a form of feedback, even if it is not framed as protest. This realization reframed disengagement as something constructive rather than destructive. Men understood that stepping back was not abandoning responsibility, but redirecting it toward areas where their effort produced tangible benefit. Responsibility, in this sense, became local rather than abstract. Men focused on what they could influence directly instead of sacrificing for outcomes beyond their control. This local focus has profound psychological benefits. When effort reliably produces results, motivation strengthens. When results are unpredictable or disconnected from effort, motivation erodes. Men gravitated toward environments where cause and effect remained intact. As a result, many men have become highly effective within their chosen domains. They build efficient routines. They maintain their physical condition. They manage finances conservatively. They pursue mastery in hobbies or skills that reward discipline. These areas provide feedback that is immediate and honest. Honest feedback builds confidence. Confidence rooted in competence is fundamentally different from confidence rooted in approval. Approval based confidence fluctuates with opinion. Competence based confidence remains stable because it is self verified. Men who have walked away increasingly rely on the latter. This internal confidence changes how men handle uncertainty. They are less anxious about the future because they trust their ability to adapt. They do not require guarantees. They require options. Options exist when one is not over leveraged emotionally, financially, or socially. Men intentionally reduce leverage. They avoid entanglements that restrict movement. They favor arrangements that preserve exit paths. This is not fear driven, it is flexibility driven. Flexibility allows men to respond to change without panic. Another consequence of this mindset is how men perceive authority. They no longer assume legitimacy based on position alone. They assess credibility through consistency and results. Authority that cannot justify itself loses influence. Men comply less reflexively and question more quietly. Quiet questioning is difficult to counter because it does not announce itself. It simply results in non participation. Non participation exposes dependency. As men disengage, certain assumptions are challenged. The assumption that men will always show up, the assumption that men will always provide, the assumption that men will always absorb consequences they did not create. These assumptions persist in rhetoric long after they stop being true in practice. This lag between rhetoric and reality creates tension, but tension alone does not reverse behavior. Only alignment does. Men are not demanding alignment, they are acting as if it is required. As this behavior becomes more common, men begin to recognize each other through subtle cues, shared priorities, similar routines, parallel decisions. There is a sense of unspoken understanding, not organized or vocalized, but present. This understanding reinforces resolve. Men realize they are not isolated in their conclusions. They see that others reach similar decisions independently. This validation is indirect but powerful. It confirms that the pattern is real. One of the more overlooked effects of this shift is how it influences men's emotional landscape. Contrary to assumptions, men do not become emotionally numb. They become emotionally selective. They experience fewer highs and fewer lows. Emotional volatility decreases. Emotional stability increases. Stability is not exciting, but it is sustainable. And men begin to value emotional environments that are predictable and low friction. They avoid situations where emotions are weaponized or constantly escalated. They prefer calm conversations, clear expectations, and mutual respect. When these are absent, they disengage without drama. This lack of drama is often misinterpreted as indifference. In reality, it reflects a refusal to participate in cycles that lead nowhere. Men have learned that not every issue requires engagement. Some issues resolve themselves when deprived of attention, and attention is a resource. Men guard it carefully now. As attention becomes selective, men become harder to manipulate. Appeals that once relied on urgency, guilt, or obligation lose effectiveness. Men pause before responding. They assess motives. They consider long term consequences. This pause is powerful. It breaks reactive patterns. It introduces choice where habit once dominated. Choice changes everything. Men who operate from choice rather than compulsion experience a sense of agency that reshapes identity. They no longer feel like passengers in their own lives. They feel like drivers. Even when the road is uncertain, being in control of direction matters. This sense of agency also changes how men relate to failure. Failure becomes data rather than indictment. When identity is internal, mistakes do not threaten self worth. They inform adjustment. This resilience further reinforces disengagement from environments that punish mistakes disproportionately. Men seek environments that allow for learning without humiliation, where feedback is corrective rather than punitive, where growth is possible without constant risk. This preference explains why many men gravitate toward solo endeavors. Solo endeavors allow for experimentation without public consequence. Like progress is private, setbacks are manageable, success belongs entirely to the individual. There is a deep satisfaction in this ownership. As men build lives around ownership, they become less tolerant of arrangements that dilute it. Shared outcomes without shared responsibility feel unjust. Shared risk without shared authority feels dangerous. Men decline these arrangements more readily now. Declining no longer feels like loss, it feels like alignment. Alignment between values and actions creates integrity. Integrity is internally reinforcing. Men who live with integrity feel grounded. They sleep better, they worry less, they trust themselves more. This self trust is crucial. It allows men to ignore external noise. When criticism does not align with lived experience, it is dismissed. Men are no longer searching for narratives that explain their lives. They are living them. This living, quiet and unremarkable as it may appear, accumulates. Day after day of peace builds a foundation that is hard to disrupt. Disruption requires access. Access is no longer granted freely. Men have learned to control access to their time, energy, and resources. This control is the cornerstone of autonomy, and autonomy does not require isolation. It requires boundaries. Boundaries protect what matters. As men protect what matters, they become less available for roles that require constant self sacrifice. They are not opposed to contribution, they are opposed to depletion. Contribution that leaves a man weaker over time is unsustainable. Men are thinking in terms of longevity now. What can I maintain for decades? What will still make sense years from now? What choices today preserve options tomorrow? This long view naturally filters out many traditional expectations. It exposes which roles were built on short term extraction rather than mutual benefit. When extraction is recognized, consent is withdrawn. This withdrawal is not reversible through pressure. Pressure reinforces withdrawal. Only genuine restructuring could alter the equation. And even then, trust would rebuild slowly, if at all. Men are comfortable with this uncertainty. They are not waiting for reform. They are living well without it. This is what makes the shift durable. It does not depend on outcomes beyond the individual. It is self-sustaining. Men who have walked away do not feel like they are missing something. They feel like they have found something, a rhythm that suits them, a pace they can maintain, a life that feels coherent. Coherence is deeply satisfying. It aligns effort with reward. It aligns values with actions. It aligns expectations with reality. Once alignment is achieved, disalignment becomes intolerable. Men will not willingly return to chaos once they have structured calm. This is why the movement continues quietly. No slogans are needed. No leaders are required. The incentive structure does the work. Men follow incentives that preserve peace. And peace, once established, becomes the highest priority. As this long arc reaches its present moment, what stands out most is not conflict, but contrast. On one side is a world still operating on assumptions formed decades ago, assuming male participation is automatic, assuming male effort is renewable, assuming male sacrifice has no limit. On the other side is a growing population of men who have quietly revised those assumptions for themselves and adjusted their lives accordingly. The contrast between expectation and reality grows sharper with each passing year. Men who have walked away, they did not do so impulsively. They did not wake up angry and decide to disengage. They arrived here through accumulation. Accumulation of experiences that did not match promises. Accumulation of lessons learned through observation rather than ideology. Accumulation of moments where effort failed to produce stability, respect, or reciprocity. Over time, those moments formed a pattern, and patterns inform decisions. Once men internalize that pattern, their behavior changes permanently. This permanence is what many observers underestimate. They assume this is a temporary reaction, a phase that will pass once conditions change or messaging improves. But men are not reacting to messaging, they are responding to lived reality. Reality does not shift because of persuasion alone, it shifts when structures change. And even then, memory remains. Men remember what it cost them to learn these lessons. They remember the time lost, the energy drained, the trust broken. Memory informs caution. Caution informs boundaries. Boundaries inform behavior. Behavior, once adjusted, becomes habit. Habits are difficult to undo when they produce better outcomes. Men who sleep better, think clearer, save more, and feel calmer have no incentive to abandon those results. There is no argument more persuasive than a life that works. This is why attempts to reframe male withdrawal as a problem miss the point. Men are not trying to solve a social puzzle. They are solving their own lives. Social consequences may follow, but they are not the motivator. Self-preservation is not selfishness. It is instinct refined through experience. Men have learned that they cannot outsource responsibility for their well-being to systems that do not prioritize it. They cannot rely on narratives that shift with convenience. They cannot trust incentives that punish consistency and reward volatility. So they take responsibility themselves. This responsibility looks different than it once did. It is quieter, less visible, less performative. Men are no longer proving anything. They are maintaining something, and maintenance is underrated. It does not produce spectacle, it produces continuity. Men who value continuity organize their lives to protect it. They simplify, they streamline, they reduce points of failure, they remove unnecessary friction, they prioritize what they can control and release what they cannot. This release is often mistaken for apathy. It is not. It is discernment. Discernment allows men to engage selectively rather than compulsively. It allows them to care deeply about fewer things rather than shallowly about many. It allows them to invest where returns are tangible rather than symbolic. Symbolic rewards no longer satisfy men who have seen how easily symbols are withdrawn. Tangible outcomes are harder to erase. This emphasis on tangibility reshapes everything from relationships to careers to daily routines. Men gravitate toward work that produces measurable results. They prefer environments where expectations are explicit. They choose commitments with clear boundaries. Boundaries protect peace. Peace protects clarity. Clarity informs choice. Choice is the cornerstone of autonomy. Men who have autonomy do not feel trapped. They do not feel resentful. They do not feel compelled to justify their lives to outsiders. They live according to internal standards and accept the consequences of those choices without complaint. This acceptance is often misunderstood. Outsiders see men disengaging and assume dissatisfaction. In reality, dissatisfaction often preceded disengagement. What follows is adjustment. Adjustment brings alignment. Alignment is powerful because it removes internal conflict. When actions match values, there is little friction. When values are clear, decisions become easier. When decisions are easier, stress decreases. Stress reduction has cascading effects. Health improves. Focus sharpens. Mood stabilizes. Men experience a version of themselves that feels more authentic, more grounded, more sustainable. Sustainability becomes the central goal, not growth at any cost, not achievement at the expense of peace, not approval purchased through self erosion. Sustainability. Sustainable lives are built slowly and deliberately. They are not optimized for attention, they are optimized for endurance. Endurance is rarely celebrated, but it is deeply respected by those who understand its value. Men who have walked away understand it intimately. As more men adopt this framework, the cultural narrative continues to lag behind reality. Advice offered assumes motivations that no longer exist. Criticism targets behaviors without understanding incentives. Calls for engagement assume obligation without addressing risk. Men do not respond because they do not need to. Their lives function without validation from those narratives. This silence is not hostility, it is independence. Independence does not ask permission. As independence spreads, it changes the social terrain. Participation becomes optional, effort becomes conditional, commitment becomes selective. This does not mean connection disappears. It means connection must be mutually beneficial to persist. It must respect boundaries. It must offer stability rather than volatility. Men are open to that kind of connection. They are not open to chaos disguised as progress or obligation disguised as virtue. This distinction matters. Those who adapt to it will find men still capable of loyalty, generosity, and depth. Those who ignore it will continue to experience absence and confusion. Men are not required to rescue systems that do not serve them. They are not obligated to repeat patterns that harm them. They are allowed to choose differently. Choosing differently does not make them villains. It makes them responsible for their own outcomes. Responsibility without agency is exploitation. Responsibility with agency is empowerment. Men have chosen the latter. As this chapter continues to unfold, one thing becomes clear. Men did not disappear. They relocated their focus. They withdrew from arenas that demanded too much and offered too little, and they invested in spaces where effort and reward align. They are not coming back to what they left behind because what they left behind no longer competes with what they have built. This is the part many do not want to hear. Once a man builds a peaceful, autonomous life, he does not feel compelled to dismantle it for nostalgia or pressure. He does not trade calm for chaos. He does not trade clarity for confusion. He chooses himself quietly and consistently. And that choice, multiplied across millions of men, reshapes society, whether acknowledged or not. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with it or do you see things differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they deserve honest discussion. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.